Richard's confidence shattered like glass. Elena watched through the small window in the consultation room door as he paced like a caged animal, his carefully styled hair dishevelled from running his hands through it. Gerald Hoffman sat at the table with his head in his hands, the financial disclosure spread out before him like evidence at a crime scene. Vanessa stood in the corner, her arms crossed, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. 38 billion, Richard kept repeating, his voice rising with each iteration. $38 billion! How is that even possible? Elena drove a Honda Civic. She clipped coupons. She bought her clothes at fucking Target. She was hiding it, Hoffman said, his voice hollow. She was pretending to be poor. She wasn't pretending, Vanessa snapped. She is poor. This has to be fake, some kind of fraud. There's no way a social worker from Ohio is secretly a billionaire. Elena leaned against the wall outside the consultation room, listening. Victoria stood beside her, checking her phone with the calm of someone who'd orchestrated this entire collapse and was simply waiting for the final domino to fall. Morrison Media isn't fake, Victoria said quietly, though Eleanor knew no one in the consultation room could hear her. It's one of the oldest media dynasties in America. Thomas Morrison built it from a single newspaper in 1952 into a global empire. 47 newspapers, 8 television stations, streaming platforms, publishing houses, the Sterling Morrison joint venture that Gordon Sterling's firm represents. She smiled, which means Gordon has known the Morrison family for decades. He just never connected the dots, because Elena kept her maiden name off all the public documents. Through the window, Elena watched Richard stop pacing. He turned to face Hoffman, and even from here, Elena could see the desperation in his eyes. There has to be a way, Richard said. Community property. Washington is a community property state. Anything acquired during the marriage is inheritance, Hoffman interrupted wearily. The trust was established before you were married. It matured on her 30th birthday, which was last month. It's separate property, Richard. You can't touch a single dollar. But she lived off my income, Richard argued. She used my money for rent, for food, for everything. That has to count for something. That has to give me some claim. It gives you nothing, Hoffman said. If anything, it makes your position worse. You forced her to live on her salary while you enjoyed your wealth. You kept finances completely separate. You made her feel like she was dependent on you. He looked up at Richard with something between pity and disgust. You played yourself, Richard. If you'd treated her like an equal partner, if you'd commingled finances, there might be an argument. But you were so concerned with protecting your assets from her that you inadvertently protected hers from you. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her face went even paler. "It's my father," she said. "He wants to see me, now." "Let him wait," Richard said. "Vanessa, we need to figure this out. We need to—" "Figure what out?" Vanessa's voice was ice. "You told me she was nobody. You said she was a social worker who couldn't afford a decent dress. You convinced my father that divorcing her and marrying me was a smart career move." She held up her phone, showing him the screen. "Do you know what he just texted me? Morrison Media owns 40% of our international clients. Gordon Sterling has been trying to get Thomas Morrison's daughter to invest in the firm for 10 years, and you're divorcing her?" "That's what he wrote, Richard." Richard's face drained of colour. "Vanessa, I didn't know." "You didn't ask. Vanessa said, echoing Elena's words from the courtroom. You saw what you wanted to see. A poor social worker you could trade up from. She grabbed her purse. I have to go. I have to do damage control before my father decides you're too toxic to keep at the firm. Vanessa, wait! But she was already gone, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the frame. Hoffman stood up slowly, gathering the papers. Richard, I need to be very clear with you about something. Gordon Sterling just discovered that you divorced the woman who controls Morrison Media. Morrison Media, which owns or has partnerships with half the corporation Sterling represents. Morrison Media, which could destroy Gordon's business relationships with a single phone call. She wouldn't do that, Richard said, but he didn't sound convinced. Are you sure? Hoffman asked. Because the woman I just saw in that courtroom isn't the meek social worker you described. That woman let you humiliate her for weeks. She sat through that pre-trial conference and let me call her sentimental items worthless. She let you offer her $5,000 and tell her she was lucky to get it. He leaned forward. She was playing chess while you were playing checkers, Richard. And now you're in checkmate. Richard sank into a chair. What do I do? You beg, Hoffman said bluntly. You go back into that courtroom and you beg for mercy. You withdraw every motion, every claim, every demand. You accept whatever terms she offers. And you pray that she's feeling generous. I can't just... You can and you will, Hoffman interrupted, because right now your career is hanging by a thread. Gordon Sterling is in that gallery, deciding whether you're worth keeping or whether you're a liability he needs to cut loose. Your fiancée just walked out. And the woman you spent 7 years belittling is worth more than everyone in this courthouse combined. He started packing his briefcase. So yes, Richard, you're going to beg. A knock on the door made them both jump. A clerk opened it, poking his head in. 5 minutes until we reconvene, he said, then disappeared. Richard looked at himself in the small mirror on the wall. His tie was askew, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like a man who'd just watched his entire life implode. I loved her, he said quietly. I really did, at the beginning. But not enough to ask about her family, Hoffman said. Not enough to notice she never needed your money. Not enough to question why she was content living on $42,000 a year. He picked up his briefcase. You loved the idea of her, Richard. The grateful wife who made you feel successful by comparison. The moment she stopped serving that purpose, you threw her away. And now you're discovering what she was really worth. In the hallway, Victoria checked her watch. They're running out of time, she said. What do you think he'll do? Elena thought about the man she'd married 7 years ago. The public defender who'd cried when he lost his first case because it meant a good man went to prison. The man who'd held her on their wedding night and promised to love her forever, not for what she had, but for who she was. That man was gone. In his place was someone who'd calculated her worth in dollars and found her wanting. He'll try to negotiate, Elena said. He'll think there's an angle, a way to salvage this. He'll try to make a deal. And what will you say? Elena remembered Richard's voice in the restaurant. Find someone at your level. She remembered Vanessa laughing about her thrift store clothes. She remembered Hoffman calling her a professional victim. She remembered all of it. Every slight, every insult, every moment they'd made her feel small. I'll listen, Elena said, and then I'll show him what happens when nobody underestimates somebody. The clerk appeared in the hallway. Court is reconvening. All parties back to the courtroom, please. Victoria smiled. Then let's finish this. They walked back into the courtroom together. The gallery was buzzing with whispered conversations that died the moment Elena entered. She could feel every eye on her now, not with dismissal, but with something closer to awe, or fear, or both. Gordon Sterling was standing in the back of the courtroom, his phone pressed to his ear, his face tight with barely controlled anger. The other senior partners had moved away from Richard's side of the gallery, putting physical distance between themselves and the man who'd just become toxic. Richard sat at the petitioner's table alone. Hoffman was beside him, but the space between them felt enormous. The lawyer looked like he was already planning his exit strategy. Judge Reeves entered and everyone rose. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone who'd seen this play out before and knew exactly how it would end. Mr. Hoffman, the judge said, I trust you've had sufficient time to discuss the situation with your client. How would you like to proceed? Hoffman stood. Your Honor, in light of the financial disclosure, my client would like to request permission to address the court directly. Judge Reeves looked at Richard. Mr. Blackwell, this is highly irregular. You have counsel present. Please, Your Honor, Richard said, standing up. His voice cracked slightly. I need to speak. I need to. He turned and looked directly at Elena. I need to apologize. The courtroom went completely silent. Elena, Richard said, and there were actual tears in his eyes now. I made a terrible mistake. I was blind. I was arrogant. I took you for granted, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He took a step toward her table. We can fix this. We can work this out. I know I hurt you, but we had something real once. We can have it again. Please, just give me another chance. Elena looked at him. She thought about all the times she'd wanted to hear those words, all the nights she'd lain awake wondering if he'd ever see her, really see her, and realize what he was throwing away. Now she had her answer. He only saw her now because of the money, because of what she could give him, because he'd finally calculated her worth and found it acceptable. No, Elena said quietly. Richard's face crumpled. Elena, please! Mr. Blackwell, sit down, Judge Reeves said sharply. You've said your piece. Now sit down and let me do my job. Richard sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. The judge looked at Victoria. Miss Chen, does your client wish to present any additional information to the court? Victoria stood. We do, Your Honor. There's one more matter that needs to be addressed. Elena's heart began to race. This was it, the final move. Proceed, Judge Reeves said. Victoria pulled out another document. During discovery, we conducted an audit of the marital finances. Specifically, we examined the early years of Mr. Blackwell's career, when he was transitioning from public defense to corporate law. We found several interesting discrepancies. Hoffman's head snapped up. Your Honor, this is beyond the scope. Let her finish, the judge said. Victoria continued. In January 2018, Mr. Blackwell's credit cards were maxed out. His bank account was overdrawn. He was 3 months behind on his Bar Association dues. If those dues weren't paid, he would have been suspended from practicing law. She slid a document across to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The payment was made from an account belonging to Elena Morrison. $15,000. Money that saved Mr. Blackwell's career. Richard went very, very still. That same year, Victoria continued, Mr. Blackwell received a loan to cover his expenses for his first year at Hoffman, Sterling and Associates. The loan was for $50,000. It was never repaid. She produced another document. The loan came from Eleanor Morrison's personal account. "Your Honour," Hoffman started, but his voice had lost all its power. "Additionally," Victoria said, "rent for their first apartment was paid exclusively from Ms. Morrison's account for 18 months. Total amount, $78,000. She looked at Richard. "My client funded the foundation of Mr. Blackwell's career. She did it quietly, without asking for recognition or repayment. And now, 7 years later, he's argued in this court that she contributed nothing." Judge Reeves was reading the bank statements with narrowed eyes. "Mr. Hoffman, did your client disclose any of this during discovery?" Hoffman looked at Richard, who had gone completely white. "I forgot," Richard whispered. I forgot." "You forgot," Elena said, standing up, "that I saved your career. You forgot that I supported you when no one else would. You forgot every sacrifice I made because they didn't fit the story you wanted to tell." Her voice was steady, but there was steel in it now. "You wanted to paint me as a burden, as someone who took and never gave. But the truth is, Richard, I gave you everything, and you threw it away the moment you thought you found something better." The courtroom was silent. Even Gordon Sterling had stopped talking on his phone, staring at Richard with undisguised contempt. Judge Reeves set down the documents. "Mr. Blackwell, I've been on this bench for 27 years. I've seen a lot of divorce cases, but this—" She shook her head. "This is remarkable. You not only underestimated your wife's financial worth, but you completely erased her contributions to your success. And now you're discovering the cost of that erasure." She picked up her gavel. "Here's my ruling." Victoria Chen wasn't finished. Elena watched her attorney remain standing at their table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp as a predator's. The courtroom had begun to settle after Judge Reeves's words, people shifting in their seats, expecting the ruling to come down like a hammer. But Victoria's stillness commanded attention. "Your Honour," Victoria said, "before you issue your ruling, there's one more matter the court needs to consider. A matter of fraud." The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Richard's head snapped up. Hoffman half rose from his seat. "Fraud?" Judge Reeves asked, her eyebrows raised. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Chen." "It is, Your Honour, and I don't make it lightly." Victoria pulled out yet another folder from her seemingly bottomless briefcase. "As I mentioned, my client paid Mr. Blackwell's Bar Association dues in January 2018, $15,000. Without that payment, he would have been suspended from practice. But that's not the fraud I'm referring to." She walked to the centre of the courtroom, commanding the space like she owned it. In March 2018, Mr. Blackwell joined Hoffman, Sterling and Associates as a junior partner. As part of his onboarding, he was required to sign a financial disclosure form, standard practice for all partners, to ensure there are no conflicts of interest or undisclosed liabilities. Victoria placed a document on the clerk's desk. "This is that disclosure form. I'd like to direct the court's attention to line 17. Judge Reeves accepted the document and began reading. Elena watched the judge's expression shift from interest to concern. Line 17 asks, "Do you have any outstanding personal loans, debts, or financial obligations exceeding $10,000 that are not reflected in your credit report?" Victoria continued. Mr. Blackwell checked no. He signed under penalty of perjury that he had no such obligations. "Your Honour," Hoffman said, standing quickly, "that was 6 years ago. Any minor oversight—" "Minor!" Victoria's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Mr. Blackwell owed my client $65,000 at the time he signed that form. $15,000 for his bar dues, $50,000 for the loan that allowed him to accept the position at Hoffman Sterling. He failed to disclose $78,000 in back rent that my client had covered. That's a total of $143,000 in undisclosed financial obligations. She paused. That's not an oversight, Mr. Hoffman. That's material misrepresentation to his employer. Gordon Sterling stood up in the gallery. His face had gone from red to purple. He told us he had no outstanding debts. He told us his finances were clean. We base partnership decisions on financial stability and integrity. If he lied on that disclosure— "Mr. Sterling, sit down," Judge Reeves commanded. But even she looked troubled now. "There's more," Victoria said. In 2019, Mr. Blackwell began work on the Meridian Publishing acquisition, a $200 million deal that would become the cornerstone of his partnership track at the firm. He was chosen to lead that acquisition because he claimed he had no conflicts of interest, no personal or financial connections to any party involved in the transaction. She produced another document, and Elena realized with a chill what was coming. Meridian Publishing, Victoria said, is a subsidiary of Morrison Media. It has been since 2003. Mr. Blackwell was negotiating on behalf of a client against a company owned by his wife's family, a company that would eventually become his wife's company. A conflict of interest so profound that had it been disclosed, he would have been removed from the case immediately. The courtroom erupted. Gordon Sterling was shouting something. The other senior partners were on their phones. Richard had gone from white to grey, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "Your Honor," Hoffman tried, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Judge Reeves slammed her gavel down 3 times. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom, or I will clear it." The noise died down. In the terrible silence that followed, Victoria continued as if nothing had happened. Mr. Blackwell earned a $3.2 million bonus for successfully closing the Meridian acquisition, she said, a bonus he earned by negotiating against his own wife's company without disclosing the conflict. Under Washington State Bar Association rules, this constitutes a clear ethics violation. Under his firm's partnership agreement, she looked directly at Gordon Sterling. This constitutes grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of partnership stake. Hoffman was frantically flipping through papers, searching for something, anything to counter with. Richard just sat frozen, staring at Victoria like she was the angel of death come to collect. "But that's not the worst part," Victoria said, and Elena almost felt sorry for Richard. Almost. The worst part is what Mr. Blackwell did with the information he gained during that acquisition. Specifically, the proprietary financial data he accessed regarding Morrison Media's expansion plans. She pulled out one final document. Elena recognized it immediately. It was the report Richard had brought home in 2020. The one he'd been so excited about. The one that had earned him a promotion. In 2020, Mr. Blackwell published a market analysis predicting major shifts in the digital media landscape. That analysis was used by several of his clients to make investment decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was hailed as brilliant foresight. Victoria's voice was ice now. It was actually based on confidential strategic plans he'd seen during the Meridian acquisition. Plans that belonged to Morrison Media. Plans he had no legal right to use. "That's insider trading," Judge Reeves said quietly. "Not exactly, Your Honor. It's not securities fraud, Because Morrison Media is privately held. But it is misappropriation of trade secrets. It is breach of fiduciary duty. And it is absolutely grounds for disbarment. Gordon Sterling's voice carried from the back of the courtroom. You son of a bitch! He was staring at Richard with pure hatred. You've been using privileged information from your wife's company for years. Every deal, every acquisition, every strategic move. You had inside information, and you never disclosed it. He turned to the other senior partners. We have to disclose this to the Bar Association immediately. If this gets out and we didn't report it, the entire firm could be sanctioned. Richard finally found his voice. I didn't know! I swear to God, I didn't know Elena owned Morrison Media. I thought, ignorance isn't a defense, Victoria interrupted. You had a duty to investigate potential conflicts of interest. You had a duty to disclose your wife's background. You chose not to because you assumed she was nobody. That assumption has now created a liability that could destroy your career and damage your firm's reputation. Hoffman had his head in his hands. Gordon Sterling was already heading for the door, phone pressed to his ear. The other senior partners were following him like rats, abandoning a sinking ship. Richard stood up, his chair scraping loudly in the silent courtroom. He looked at Elena with desperate eyes. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. I'll make it right. Just tell me what you want." Elena stood up slowly. She walked around the table, crossing the space between them until she was standing directly in front of her ex-husband. The man she'd loved. The man she'd supported. The man who'd thrown her away like trash. "What I want," Elena said softly, "is for you to finally understand what you lost." "I know what I lost," Richard said desperately. "I lost you. I lost $38 billion. I lost—" "You lost nothing," Elena interrupted, "because you never had me. Not really. You had an idea of me, a fiction you created to make yourself feel successful. The grateful wife who needed you, the poor social worker who made you look generous by comparison." She stepped closer. "But I never needed you, Richard. I funded your career. I saved you from bankruptcy. I supported you when you had nothing. And the moment you thought you didn't need me anymore, you discarded me." "I made a mistake," Richard said. Tears were streaming down his face now, and Elena realized they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of loss. Loss of money, loss of status, loss of the life he'd planned with Vanessa Sterling. "Elena, please, I'm begging you, don't destroy me." "I'm not destroying you," Elena said. "You destroyed yourself. I'm just making sure everyone sees the wreckage." She turned to Victoria. "I believe we have everything we need." "Not quite," Victoria said. She addressed the judge. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, we're filing a counter-motion. We're seeking sanctions against Mr. Blackwell for fraud, misrepresentation, and abuse of process. We're also notifying the Washington State Bar Association of potential ethics violations that warrant investigation, and we're formally requesting that the court order Mr. Blackwell to repay the $143,000 my client lent him during their marriage, with interest compounded over 7 years. That's over $200,000, Hoffman said weakly. $217,432.18 to be precise. Victoria said, "My client would like that money returned, not because she needs it." She glanced at the financial disclosure still sitting on the judge's bench. "But because it's the principle of the matter. You don't get to use someone and then claim they used you. Judge Reeves was writing notes, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up. "Mr. Blackwell," the judge said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you know about your wife's financial background when you filed for divorce?" "No," Richard said. "I swear I didn't." "Did you investigate her background? Did you ask about her family? Did you do any due diligence at all before deciding she was worthless?" Richard opened his mouth, closed it. He couldn't answer without incriminating himself either way. If he said yes, he'd been lying. If he said no, he'd been negligent. "I thought I knew her," he finally said. "You didn't," Judge Reeves said flatly. "And that negligence has cost you dearly." She picked up her gavel. "I'm granting the divorce. I'm voiding the prenuptial agreement on the grounds that it was signed under false pretenses, Mr. Blackwell believed his wife had no assets, when in fact she had considerable assets she was simply choosing not to disclose. However, given that all of Mrs. Morrison's assets are inheritance and separate property, there will be no division of those assets." Richard let out a breath, clearly relieved. "However," the judge continued, and Richard's face fell again, "Mr. Blackwell will repay Mrs. Morrison the $217,000 she lent him, plus court costs and Mrs. Morrison's legal fees. Additionally, Mr. Blackwell will pay sanctions to the court in the amount of $50,000 for bringing a frivolous motion claiming Mrs. Morrison owed him money when he, in fact, owed her money." "Your Honor," Hoffman started. "I'm not finished," Judge Reeves said. "Mrs. Morrison is also awarded judgment for defamation, emotional distress, and malicious prosecution. The court finds that Mr. Blackwell's characterization of his ex-wife as a financial drain, a professional victim, and someone who contributed nothing constitutes defamation, particularly given that he made these statements publicly to the press. Damages are awarded in the amount of $5 million. The courtroom gasped. Richard swayed on his feet like he might faint. "But, Your Honor," Hoffman said desperately, "Mr. Blackwell doesn't have $5 million in liquid assets. His partnership stake is tied up in the firm." "Then I suggest he liquidate it," Judge Reeves said. "Quickly. Because if these damages aren't paid within 90 days, I'm authorizing Mrs. Morrison's attorneys to begin seizing assets, including the penthouse, the vehicles, and yes, Mr. Hoffman, the partnership stake." She banged her gavel. "Case closed. And Mr. Blackwell, I'm formally recommending to the Bar Association that they investigate the matters Miss Chen has raised. That's all." She stood and swept out of the courtroom, leaving chaos in her wake. Richard collapsed into his chair. Hoffman was already packing his briefcase, clearly planning his exit. In the gallery, Gordon Sterling had returned, and he was staring at Richard with the expression of a man calculating exactly how much damage control he'd need to do. Elena walked toward the courtroom doors, Victoria beside her. As they passed Richard's table, he looked up at her one last time. "I really did love you," he said, "at the beginning." Elena paused. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man she'd married was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. "No," she said quietly. "You loved what I did for you. There's a difference." She walked out into the hallway, where cameras were waiting, where reporters were shouting questions, where her old life ended and her new one began. "Miss Morrison," a reporter called, "how do you feel about the judgment?" Elena thought about Richard's face when he'd seen the number 38 billion. She thought about Vanessa laughing about her thrift store clothes. She thought about 7 years of being made to feel small by someone who was, in every way that mattered, smaller than her. I feel, Elena said, like justice was served. She walked away and she didn't look back. Judge Reeves had seen many things in her 27 years on the bench, but this case would stay with her. Elena could see it in the way the judge looked at Richard now, not with anger, but with something closer to anthropological curiosity, like she was studying a particularly foolish specimen of humanity. Mr. Blackwell, Judge Reeves said, adjusting her glasses, in my career, I've presided over hundreds of divorce cases. I've seen greed, betrayal, and cruelty in forms that would shock most people. But this case represents something else entirely. This is a masterclass in how arrogance and assumption can destroy a life. Richard sat motionless at the petitioner's table. Gerald Hoffman had physically moved his chair 6 inches away, creating visible distance between himself and his client. In the gallery, the seats where Gordon Sterling and the senior partners had been sitting were empty. They'd fled the courtroom the moment Judge Reeves called the recess, already planning how to excise Richard from the firm before the contagion spread. You stood in this courtroom, the judge continued, and argued that your wife was worthless. You quantified her contributions in dollars and found them lacking. You mocked her career, her choices, her character. You invited the press to witness what you believed would be your triumph. She paused. And in doing so, you revealed everything about yourself, and nothing about her. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but the reality was different. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt tired. The bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd spent 7 years pretending to be smaller than she was, only to discover the person she'd done it for wasn't worth the sacrifice. The divorce is granted, Judge Reeves said. Each party will retain their separate property. Mrs. Morrison keeps the entirety of the Morrison media empire and all associated assets. Mr. Blackwell keeps his partnership stake at Hoffman, Sterling and Associates. She paused meaningfully. Assuming he still has one after today. Your Honor, Hoffman tried weakly, but the judge held up a hand. I'm not finished. Mr. Blackwell, you will repay Mrs. Morrison the sum of $217,432.18, the money she lent you to save your career, with interest calculated over 7 years. You will pay court costs in the amount of $47,000. You will pay Mrs. Morrison's legal fees, which I'm estimating at approximately $250,000, given Miss Chen's hourly rate and the complexity of this case. Richard made a strangled sound. Elena knew what he was calculating. Over $500,000 in payments, and he'd already spent most of his liquid assets on the penthouse renovations and Vanessa's engagement ring. Additionally, Judge Reeves continued, I'm awarding Mrs. Morrison damages for defamation in the amount of $5 million. Your public statements to the press, your characterization of her as a financial drain and professional victim, your claim that she contributed nothing, all of this constitutes defamation given the facts as we now know them. You damaged her reputation in pursuit of a narrative that was not only false, but malicious. Your Honor, my client can't possibly, Hoffman started. Your client should have thought of that before he invited reporters to watch him humiliate his wife, Judge Reeves said sharply. Actions have consequences, Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Blackwell is about to learn that lesson the hard way. She picked up the documents Victoria had submitted about the bar disclosure, the Meridian conflict, the misappropriated information. Her expression grew even grimmer. As for the ethics violations Miss Chen has brought to light, I'm not qualified to adjudicate those. However, I am mandated by law to report potential attorney misconduct to the Washington State Bar Association. I will be forwarding this entire case file to them by end of business today. I expect they'll be very interested in your failure to disclose financial obligations, your failure to identify conflicts of interest, and your apparent use of privileged information gained through your marriage. Richard's head dropped into his hands. In the gallery, Elena noticed two people she hadn't seen before, a man and woman in dark suits, both taking notes. Bar Association investigators, she realized. They'd shown up the moment word got out about the ethics violations. "Mr. Blackwell, do you have anything to say before I close this case?" Judge Reeves asked. Richard stood slowly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. His expensive suit seemed to hang wrong on him now, like the man inside had somehow diminished. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I hurt someone who only ever helped me. I was blind and stupid and arrogant." He turned to look at Elena. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry." Elena met his eyes. She saw desperation there, yes, but also calculation. He was already thinking about appeals, about how to minimize the damage, about whether he could somehow negotiate the financial penalties down. Even now, in his lowest moment, he was strategizing. That was who Richard Blackwell was. A man who thought every problem had a legal solution, every relationship a contract to be optimized. "Your apology," Elena said quietly, "is 7 years too late." Judge Reeves banged her gavel one final time. "This case is closed. Mr. Blackwell, you have 90 days to make the first payment. Miss Chen will coordinate with Mr. Hoffman regarding the payment schedule. This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted as soon as the judge left. Reporters surged toward the railing, shouting questions. The Bar Association investigators moved toward Richard and Hoffman. And through the side door, Elena saw Vanessa Sterling enter briefly, her face pale, her engagement ring conspicuously absent from her left hand. Vanessa caught Richard's eye across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Vanessa shook her head slowly, a tiny gesture that somehow conveyed everything. The engagement was over. The strategic alliance was broken. Richard had gone from rising star to toxic liability in less than 3 hours. Richard watched her leave, and something in his expression finally broke. Not the calculated emotion of a man performing for an audience, but genuine devastation. He'd lost everything. The money, the girl, the future he'd planned. The life he thought he deserved. Victoria touched Elena's arm. "We should go. There's a car waiting in the underground garage. Unless you want to make a statement to the press." Elena looked at the reporters, the cameras, the spectacle Richard had created. She thought about what she could say. She could be magnanimous in victory, take the high road, talk about forgiveness and moving forward. That's what people would expect from a social worker, from someone who'd spent her career helping broken families heal. But Elena was tired of being what people expected. "One statement," she said, "then we leave." Victoria nodded and led her toward the hallway where the reporters were waiting. The questions started immediately, overlapping, frantic. "Miss Morrison, how does it feel to win? Will you take over your ex-husband's partnership? Are you planning to sue the firm? What do you say to critics who claim you deceived your husband?" Elena waited until the noise died down. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. I didn't deceive anyone, she said. I lived authentically within my means. I worked a job I loved and helped children who needed help. I supported my husband when he had nothing, and I asked for nothing in return. The fact that he assumed my simplicity meant poverty says everything about him and nothing about me. But you hid your wealth, a reporter started. I live my life, Elena corrected. I chose not to publicize my family background because I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I inherit. That's not deception, that's self-preservation. And I was right to be cautious, wasn't I? The moment my ex-husband discovered my wealth, he tried to reconcile, not because he loved me, but because he finally calculated my worth and found it acceptable. She paused, making sure every camera was focused on her. The courtroom erupted as soon as the judge left. Reporters surged toward the railing, shouting questions. The Bar Association investigators moved toward Richard and Hoffman. And through the side door, Elena saw Vanessa Sterling enter briefly, her face pale, her engagement ring conspicuously absent from her left hand. Vanessa caught Richard's eye across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Vanessa shook her head slowly, a tiny gesture that somehow conveyed everything. The engagement was over. The strategic alliance was broken. Richard had gone from rising star to toxic liability in less than 3 hours. Richard watched her leave, and something in his expression finally broke. Not the calculated emotion of a man performing for an audience, but genuine devastation. He'd lost everything. The money, the girl, the future he'd planned. The life he thought he deserved. Victoria touched Elena's arm. We should go. There's a car waiting in the underground garage. Unless you want to make a statement to the press. Elena looked at the reporters, the cameras, the spectacle Richard had created. She thought about what she could say. She could be magnanimous in victory, take the high road, talk about forgiveness and moving forward. That's what people would expect from a social worker, from someone who'd spent her career helping broken families heal. But Elena was tired of being what people expected. One statement, she said, then we leave. Victoria nodded and led her toward the hallway where the reporters were waiting. The questions started immediately, overlapping, frantic. Miss Morrison, how does it feel to win? Will you take over your ex-husband's partnership? Are you planning to sue the firm? What do you say to critics who claim you deceived your husband? Elena waited until the noise died down. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. I didn't deceive anyone, she said. I lived authentically within my means. I worked a job I loved and helped children who needed help. I supported my husband when he had nothing, and I asked for nothing in return. The fact that he assumed my simplicity meant poverty says everything about him and nothing about me. But you hid your wealth, a reporter started. I live my life, Elena corrected. I chose not to publicize my family background because I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I inherit. That's not deception, that's self-preservation. And I was right to be cautious, wasn't I? The moment my ex-husband discovered my wealth, he tried to reconcile, not because he loved me, but because he finally calculated my worth and found it acceptable. She paused, making sure every camera was focused on her. Let me be very clear about something. Wealth doesn't define worth. Character does. I spent 7 years with a man who claimed to love me while systematically diminishing everything I was. He called my career pointless. He mocked my choices. He measured my value in dollars and decided I wasn't worth keeping. And now he's learning the cost of that mistake. Are you seeking revenge? A reporter asked. I'm seeking accountability, Elena said. There's a difference. My ex-husband committed ethics violations. He lied to his firm. He used privileged information he gained through our marriage to advance his career. He stood in a courtroom and defamed me publicly to make himself look better. Those are facts, not revenge. And facts have consequences. What about forgiveness? Elena smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd finally stopped pretending. Forgiveness is earned, she said, and some debts can't be paid with apologies. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Real work. The kind that actually helps people, instead of just generating billable hours. She turned and walked toward the elevator, Victoria beside her. Behind them, she could hear the reporters shouting follow-up questions, the click of cameras, the frenzy of a story that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. In the elevator, descending toward the underground garage, Victoria finally spoke. That was quite a statement, she said. Very different from the quiet social worker your husband described. I was never quiet, Elena said. I was just surrounded by people who didn't want to hear what I had to say. She looked at her reflection in the polished elevator doors. A woman in a department store suit who controlled a $38 billion empire. Both things were true. Neither defined her completely. What happens now? Now the Bar Association investigates. That could take months, but given what we've provided, I'd say Richard's looking at a suspension at minimum, possibly disbarment. Hoffman, Sterling will almost certainly terminate him to avoid liability. The defamation judgment and loan repayment will bankrupt him unless he liquidates everything. And Vanessa Sterling, well, you saw her face. That engagement is done. And us? Elena asked. What do we do? Victoria smiled. You go back to your life, your real life. The foundation is waiting for your input on the new initiatives. The board wants to meet you. Actually meet you this time, not the shadow figure your father kept them from seeing. You have a media empire to run, Elena, or at least to guide, and you have the resources now to make the kind of impact you've always wanted to make. The elevator doors opened to reveal a black car waiting, its engine running. Not a limousine. Elena had been very specific about that. Just a town car, comfortable but not ostentatious. The driver opened the door, and Elena slid inside. As they pulled out of the garage, passing the reporters still clustered around the courthouse entrance, Elena's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Please, we need to talk. I can explain everything. We can fix this. Don't, Richard. Elena stared at the message for a long moment. She thought about the Richard she'd married, the man who'd cried in her arms after losing his first case. She wondered if that man had ever really existed, or if she'd just invented him, projecting her hopes onto someone who was always exactly what he appeared to be. Ambitious, calculating, and ultimately hollow. She deleted the message without responding. Where to? Victoria asked. Elena thought about the penthouse, about 7 years of memories she'd left behind. She thought about the life she'd tried to build with Richard, the fiction they'd both maintained for different reasons. The foundation office, Elena said. I want to see the new youth housing proposal. And I need to contact the directors about expanding our legal aid services. If this case taught me anything, it's that people need advocates who actually care about them, not lawyers who see them as billable hours. Victoria smiled. Your father would be proud. My father, Elena said quietly, spent his whole life building an empire. I'm going to spend mine making sure that Empire does more than generate profit. Morrison Media is going to fund journalism that matters, publish books that change minds, create platforms for voices that don't usually get heard. And the foundation is going to help families like the ones I've worked with my whole career. We're going to fund legal aid, housing assistance, educational programs. That's a tall order, Victoria said. I have $38 billion, Elena replied. I think I can manage. 3 months later, Elena stood in front of the mirror in her new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in the same neighborhood where she'd lived before the marriage. She'd looked at penthouses, at mansions, at properties that came with staff and security, and every luxury imaginable. But in the end, she'd chosen this: a place with good light, a small balcony, and a reasonable commute to the foundation office. She was still a social worker. She still helped families navigate the system. But now she had resources beyond a non-profit's shoestring budget. Morrison Media's charitable foundation had tripled its giving. They'd opened 3 new family resource centres. They'd hired 12 more social workers. And Elena went to work every day, knowing she was making a real difference. The defamation judgment had been paid. Richard had been forced to sell the penthouse and liquidate his partnership stake to cover it. Hoffman, Sterling had terminated him 2 weeks after the trial, citing ethics violations and reputational damage to the firm. The Bar Association was still investigating, but the preliminary findings suggested a 2-year suspension at minimum. Vanessa Sterling had married someone else, a venture capitalist from a good family, someone Gordon Sterling could approve of. Elena had seen the announcement in the society pages and felt nothing. Her phone buzzed. A reminder about tonight's event, the Morrison Foundation's annual gala, the first one Elena would attend not as a shadow but as herself. Board members, donors, journalists, politicians, people who wanted to meet the mysterious Morrison heiress, to see what she'd do with her father's empire. Elena adjusted her dress, Chanel vintage from her mother's collection. It fit perfectly. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she'd changed, but because she'd finally stopped hiding. There was a knock at the door. Victoria, arriving to escort her to the gala. "Ready?" Victoria asked when Eleanor opened the door. Elena thought about Richard, about the life she'd left behind, about the woman she'd pretended to be for 7 years. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more powerful. "I'm ready," Elena said, and she was. The boardroom of Morrison Tower occupied the entire 47th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that made even the most jaded executives pause. Elena sat at the head of the mahogany table that had belonged to her great-grandfather, surrounded by 12 board members who still looked slightly uncomfortable with her presence. Not because she was incompetent. The last 6 months had proven she had her father's instincts and her own vision, but because she insisted on conducting board meetings in a cardigan and sensible shoes, taking calls from her social work clients in the middle of quarterly reviews, and treating billion-dollar decisions with the same practical assessment she'd once applied to foster care placements. The Asia-Pacific expansion is performing above projections, Charles Whitmore, the CFO, was saying. We're seeing particularly strong growth in digital subscriptions. The investment in investigative journalism is paying dividends in both reputation and revenue. Elena nodded, reviewing the figures on her tablet. Morrison Media had undergone significant changes since she'd taken control. More funding for actual journalism, less focus on clickbait, partnerships with non-profits to cover underreported issues, a commitment to paying freelancers fairly and on time. The board had initially resisted. These weren't traditionally profitable ventures, but Elena had been firm. The Morrison fortune could afford to prioritize integrity over quarterly earnings. What about the legal aid initiative? Elena asked. The partnership with the National Legal Defense Fund? Fully funded, Victoria Chen said from her seat at Elena's right hand. She'd joined the board as general counsel 3 months ago, bringing with her a reputation that made opposing attorneys reconsider their strategies. We've established offices in 12 cities. The feedback from both attorneys and clients has been exceptional. We're making a real difference. Making a real difference. That phrase would have made Richard laugh back when they were married. He'd called her work playing social worker, as if helping struggling families was a hobby rather than a calling. Elena wondered if he understood now, or if he was still too deep in his own collapse to see anything beyond his immediate survival. She knew what had happened to him, of course. It was impossible not to. The legal community was small enough that news travelled fast, and Richard's fall had been spectacular enough to generate its own mythology. The Bar Association had suspended his license for 3 years. Hoffman, Sterling had not only terminated him, but sued him for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, seeking to recover the bonuses he'd earned through tainted work. The defamation judgment had forced him to liquidate everything. The penthouse sold at a loss in a hurry sale, his art collection auctioned off, even his car seized to cover the debt. He'd moved into a studio apartment in Queens, the kind of place he used to joke about when he was feeling superior to his public defender days. He'd tried to reach out dozens of times, texts, emails, even a handwritten letter delivered to the foundation office. All of them said variations of the same thing. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I need help, please. Elena had read the first few. Then she'd asked her assistant to filter them out. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt, and she had neither the time nor the inclination to become Richard's rehabilitation project. Elena? Victoria's voice brought her back to the present. The press is asking about your appearance at the Children's Advocacy Summit next week. They want to know if you'll be speaking about your social work background. I will, Elena said. I'm planning to announce a new initiative, full-ride scholarships for students pursuing social work degrees, with a commitment to work in underserved communities. We're funding 100 scholarships per year to start, with room to expand. The board members exchanged glances. 100 full scholarships, with living stipends included, would cost roughly $15 million annually. Chump change for Morrison Media's charitable foundation, but the kind of money that could transform an entire field. That's quite a commitment, Whitmore said carefully. Social workers are overworked, underpaid, and undervalued, Elena said. They're doing some of the most important work in our society for poverty wages. If we can remove the financial barrier to entry, we'll attract more talented people to the field. Better social workers means better outcomes for vulnerable families. It's not complicated, and it's good press, Victoria added with a slight smile. The Morrison heiress who never forgot where she came from. The billionaire who still keeps her social work license active. It's the kind of narrative that builds brand loyalty. Elena shot her a look, but Victoria was right. The past 6 months had transformed Elena from invisible to iconic. The quiet social worker with the secret fortune had become a media sensation. Proof that you could be both wealthy and genuine, both powerful and principled. Interview requests flooded in daily. Fashion magazines wanted to feature her accessible elegance. Business publications wanted to understand her management philosophy. Everyone wanted a piece of the woman who'd humiliated one of Manhattan's most arrogant attorneys and walked away with her dignity intact. The meeting concluded, and the board members filed out, leaving Eleanor and Victoria alone in the vast boardroom. Outside the windows, the city stretched out in every direction, millions of lives unfolding in buildings she could buy without thinking twice. "You got another letter," Victoria said, pulling an envelope from her briefcase. "This one's different." Elena recognized the handwriting immediately. Richard's distinctive scrawl, the same handwriting that used to leave her notes saying he'd be working late. "Don't wait up." "I thought we agreed," Elena started. "This one came through official channels," Victoria interrupted. "Through his new attorney." "It's not a plea for reconciliation. It's something else." Elena took the envelope, hesitating. 6 months. 6 months of silence after years of noise. She'd moved on, built a new life, become someone who didn't need closure because she'd never really been broken. What could Richard possibly have to say now that would matter? She opened the letter. "Elena, I'm not writing to apologize again, though I am sorry. I'm not asking for money or help or forgiveness. I'm writing because I saw the announcement about the social work scholarships, and I realized something. You were always going to do this. Whether I'd stayed married to you or not, whether I'd discovered who you were or not, you were always going to use whatever resources you had to help people. That's who you are. It's who you've always been. And I was so busy looking at the dollar amount of your salary that I never saw the person earning it. I lost my law license, my career, my fiancé, everything I thought defined me. And in losing it, I discovered that none of it actually mattered. The partnership, the penthouse, the status, all of it was just performance. I was performing success without understanding what it meant to actually be successful. You were successful the whole time. You were making a difference in people's lives. You were living according to your values. You were building something real while I was just accumulating trophies. I'm working as a paralegal now at a legal aid clinic in Brooklyn. It doesn't pay much. The office is cramped and the coffee is terrible. And we're so understaffed that I'm doing work I would have considered beneath me 2 years ago. But you know what? I'm helping people, actually helping them. Single mothers fighting for custody, immigrants navigating asylum claims, elderly people being exploited by predatory lenders. The work matters, Elena. For the first time in a decade, the work actually matters. I'm not telling you this because I want praise or because I think it changes anything between us. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that you were right. About everything. About what constitutes a meaningful life. About what defines worth. About character mattering more than wealth. I hope you're happy. I really do. And I hope somewhere, somehow, the universe sends you someone who sees you, really sees you, from the beginning. Someone who doesn't need a financial disclosure to understand your value. You deserved better than me, Richard. Elena set the letter down on the table. Victoria watched her carefully, trying to read her expression. "Well?" Victoria asked. "He's working at a legal aid clinic," Elena said. "I know. I had someone verify it. He's been there for 2 months. By all accounts, he's actually decent at the work. Humble, hard-working. Nothing like the Richard Blackwell who walked into that courtroom 6 months ago. Elena walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere down there, Richard was sitting in a cramped office, helping people who couldn't afford the lawyers he used to be. Maybe he'd finally learned the lesson. Maybe he'd finally understood that worth wasn't measured in partnership stakes and penthouse addresses. Or maybe he was just performing again, playing the role of the humbled lawyer, seeking redemption, because it was the only role left available to him. Elena realized she didn't actually care which it was. "He's right about one thing," she said. "I was always going to do this. The foundation, the scholarships, the initiatives. That was always the plan, whether he was part of my life or not. He was never essential to who I am. He was just someone I mistakenly thought I needed." "And now?" Victoria asked. "Now I know better," Elena said. She turned away from the window. "I have a meeting with the Foster Care Reform Committee in 20 minutes. And tomorrow I'm visiting the new Family Resource Centre in Brooklyn. The real work continues, Victoria. It always has. What should I do with the letter?" Elena considered. She could frame it, keep it as a trophy of her victory. She could tear it up, make a symbolic gesture of moving on. She could file it away with all the other detritus of her failed marriage. In the end, she did none of those things. "Keep it in the case file," Elena said. "It's just another document, another piece of evidence that people can change, or at least pretend to. But it doesn't change anything about what happened or what I'm doing now." Her phone buzzed. A text from Maria, one of her social work colleagues, asking if Eleanor could take an emergency placement call for a teenager who'd just aged out of a bad foster situation. The kind of call Eleanor used to handle alone, scraping together resources from a non-profit's limited budget. The kind of call she could now handle with the full resources of the Morrison Foundation behind her. "I have to go," Elena said, gathering her things. "Real work to do." Victoria smiled. "You know, for someone who just won a $5 million defamation judgment and inherited a $38 billion empire, you're remarkably unimpressed with yourself." "Money doesn't impress me," Elena said, heading for the door. "It never did. That was always the point." She left Morrison Tower and walked to the subway. She still took public transportation, much to her security team's dismay, heading toward the foundation office where a scared teenager was waiting for someone to care whether she had a place to sleep tonight. This was the work that mattered. This was what defined her, not the fortune she'd inherited, not the man she'd defeated, not the empire she now controlled. Just the quiet, persistent work of showing up for people who needed help. That evening, as Elena sat with the teenager in the Foundation's Crisis Intervention Office, helping her fill out housing applications and calling in favours to get her into a decent transitional program, she thought about Richard's letter, about his claim that he'd finally found meaningful work. Maybe he had. Maybe the humiliation had genuinely transformed him. Maybe he'd become the man she'd once hoped he was. But it didn't matter. Not to her story, not to her future. She'd learned the hardest lesson of all. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And you can't make someone see your worth if they're determined to be blind. All you can do is save yourself. Know your own worth. And build a life that reflects your values. Elena had done exactly that, and she was just getting started.